gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the wonderful Erfan Ahmad show. I am joined by my roommate in the background playing his DJ set, but nonetheless. And we are here now, and we're going to be talking about quite a few things that are happening, not just on campus, but around the world. I know last time you saw me, we were discussing Muslims and their disillusionment with politics, and before that we were talking about Iran, where the U.S. stands and where Gen Z stands as a result of where the U.S. is currently in the war. We have some developments, and I like to talk about that today, but just as important the developments may be, or even though the developments are significant, we also have to consider how significant the past was, right? And we're going to be going into much detail on that. But with that being said, I want to take a minute to talk about what has been going on around campus lately. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Recently, we have an ex-Hamas hostage member coming onto campus, and he is spreading all kinds of rhetoric that you may expect, because if the chances of him being here at UCLA are already slim. Actually, not really. They're not really slim. I mean, in this day and age at UCLA, the chances of him being funded by some pro-Israeli group are high. The chances of him actually going through with it are even higher. And, what do I mean by that? I mean, well, he wasn't moderate about it at all whatsoever. And it must be pretty good money because this guy was saying some crazy things. And, it was crazy because I was walking to class, and to my left, I see a couple security guards, and I'm walking ahead, and I just see a couple more security guards, and then to my left and to my right and straight ahead, and then I see police officers. And one has to think to himself and at least wonder, why are they here? What is going on? What is so severe that it requires this amount of security? And, there were no debate booths, there were no Unfuck America, it wasn't no debate me on lesbians or whatnot, and you'd be surprised. It was just actually Hamas hostage, ex-Hamas hostage on campus. And, a lot of students, as you'd expect, had a lot to say, and it was very interesting. It was interesting that they have expanded their influence or continue to on campuses like UCLA. It's very dangerous. It's dangerous to have any kind of rhetoric that opposes their agenda. And I not only have to warn myself, I have to advise other students on campus to just be careful. Just be careful, but be firm. Be firm in understanding that what we do here on campus, whether it be protests, our advocacy, or even the rhetoric that we have, whether in person or on video, is a testament to the kind of education that we resemble. It's a testament to the resilience that the younger generation always has, opposing unnecessary war and especially ongoing genocides. So shout out to anybody who's actively going to be doing that and has done that in the past. But with that being said, we also have to talk about other things that go on campus, like ICE protests. And it hasn't been too long since the last one. And as some of you guys may know, I recently had my last debate on ICE. It was interesting. It was interesting seeing a guy who recently, again, ladies and gentlemen, this is all very recent. This guy just finished making a bunch of videos in cat ears on pop media and now is running for public office. What can you say? I mean, power doesn't discriminate. But this guy, he is quite interesting. I highly encourage everyone to check out the debate. But this guy was particularly interesting because of the fact, hold on, my retainer is low-key bothering me. Ladies and gentlemen, please, your discretion is advised. Oh. But anyways, I recently had a debate with this guy by the name of Def Noodles. And he was on campus for quite some periods of time. This guy was having booths left and right. I can't name a single spot on campus that this guy wasn't posted up on with his ugly poster and his ugly hat. But anyways, he was posted up and he was clipping a lot of students with a lot of BS. This guy, he loves to just get riled up. And then, I mean, as soon as that happens, you kind of just lose it. And it shows to the false evidences that he provides. For example, during the debate, I brought up the fact that he said 70% of detainees under the Department of... Sorry, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, so anyways, Kristi Noem's Department of Homeland Security. Please, sorry about that. I just got a message. But yeah, anyways, so Department of Homeland Security publishes this information under Immigration and Customs Enforcement and said that 70% of detainees were of a criminal background. And he was going around saying this and using it as a gotcha when that's not how it works at all. You know, a conviction, right, ladies and gentlemen, is not the same thing as a charge. And that is something I tried articulating to him, you know, because it happens. It happens. Sometimes we misread information and whatnot, but he was firm. He was firm. This guy he was convinced. He spoke to me with conviction. He told me that, no, it's just a different way of interpreting the data and this and that. And here's the thing, look. You can either interpret the data the way it's meant to be interpreted, right? Because it's objective, right? There's an objective truth with the data that we pull. And he could say that the truth is different because it's from a different organization. But the thing is, right, when we talk about the actual data, because UCLA and UC Berkeley actually utilized their ability under the Freedom of Information Act to actually garner this information. They used that to actually articulate all the missing pieces that were part of the DHS's original data output. The missing pieces were from claims that Kristi Noem would make. You know, for example, she would say things along the lines of, these immigrants or these people that have been detained have criminal backgrounds and charges back home where we're going to deport them. But not only is this administration deporting them to places where they've never been or where places they're never from, they're also not backing up this information whatsoever. And you'd think to make a big claim like that, she would go out of her way to actually provide the data on this. But to my avail, and as someone who's trying to contribute actively to this project, there is nothing, and I mean nothing, ladies and gentlemen, to back this claim up. Absolutely none. And it's not, don't just take my word for it. I mean, the Deportation Data Project is out there for everyone to see. I mean, I don't think, they don't cherry pick the information they put out, right? And this is evident by all of the data that is visible on their charts on their website. You can check it out. It should be the deportationdataproject.org. And, you know, I appreciate this because sometimes institutions, sure, may not be obligated. I hear that a lot. I hear that institutions aren't obligated to serve every piece of clarity to the American people, which is kind of a unclean hill to die on, if you will, because I don't think that's going to just slide with any person that wants full clarity from their government, telling them the government doesn't need to be clear with you, right? I mean, they don't owe you anything. That shouldn't slide with anyone. But that is the update with ICE right now. And speaking of ICE, and not just the UCLA, but the LAist actually posted something in regards to the ICE deportations happening in Los Angeles. And they reported that ICE detentions or detainees have been tripled in amount since the last quarter in which they reported. And this is not only interesting because this is a huge figure, it's exponential. We're talking times 3, but also because the Deportation Data Project actually contributed to this. And so, as we can see here, ICE arrests tripled last year in LA, and more than half of those arrested had no criminal record. And this is an issue, right? Because when we talk about there being a margin of error, because this is another argument I'll hear that it's a margin of error. I mean, in regards to the people that have no criminal background, which is 70% of people, by the way. It's not 43%, it's not 30%, it's 70%. 70% of detainees, not just according to the DHS, but according to the deportationdataproject.org with all precise and accurate information. Yeah, sure, you can hold me against my word and look at the data yourself. They have established that more than 70% of people currently detained under ICE have no criminal background. And just in with the LAist, ICE arrests tripled last year, like I just said, arresting half of the people with no criminal record. I mean, that's just insane. The fact that we think this is maybe just negligible or that this is just any other sort of information that we see on the news is just unacceptable. We have to understand that detaining people off the base, because sure you can say that them overstaying their visa or being in violation of federal law can justify detention. But we have to talk about what's the most efficient for Americans right now. We have to talk about what the American people actually need. Because do they need people with no criminal backgrounds being sent to these detention facilities? Because here's the thing. There's a lack of consistency amongst a lot of prominent members in the GOP as to where we stand with immigration and deporting the right kinds of people. On one hand, you have Trump saying things along the lines of, we need to be deporting outright criminals and terrorists. You have people like Kristi Noem saying that people like, sorry for blanking, the woman who died in Minnesota, I don't know why her name is escaping my mind right now, but quick Google check. Renee Nicole, how could I forget? Renee Nicole. And Good was also a man who was killed by ICE. That these people are terrorists, right? And they may not be people that were detained, but they're using the kind of justification, or they're using the force that's utilized by ICE to justify, or they're justifying the force used by ICE, and saying that these people are outright criminals, that they're terrorists, that this is the kind of people that they're targeting. And this is most certainly not the case. I mean, if the data doesn't resemble this, and if these news articles don't resemble this, then I simply don't know what does, and I'm just a useful idiot. But the thing is, right, ladies and gentlemen, we honestly need to be prioritizing things that serve more of a threat to Americans than anything. We should probably be focusing on people with actual convictions, people that have serious charges. Because, yes, charges and convictions are not the same thing, which is why 70% have no criminal background. But then again, if we were to actually detain people with charges, make it the rape charges. Make it the murder charges. Make it the charges in which these people are an actual threat to American society. Don't deport Consuela, or don't deport your neighbor who's been contributing to the American economy for the past 3 decades. That does us absolutely no good. And we have several, and I mean several studies to help conclude the fact that these immigrants that come into this country and produce second generation, or rather first generation Americans, are contributing net fiscally positive contributions to the American economy via the long term. And when we have rhetoric that scares people into fearing these immigrants and fearing these people, it's fear mongering. That's all it is, right? And people talk about upholding the law. We have to really analyze the history of the law, but first from a philosophical standpoint, because before we get into the numbers and the policies, I may just argue from a philosophical standpoint, because I personally believe that we can make determinations based off of philosophical inquiry and just the nature of human thought, right? But anyways, from a philosophical standpoint, a man by the name of Aristotle, I'm sure his name has been rung in your class at least once or twice in your academic tenure. He talks about rigidity, right? Aristotle has this really cool thing called the golden mean. And on one side, you have people that want to uphold the law to its utmost extent, right? You have people who want everybody to rigidly follow the law, no matter what the cause may be, no matter what the circumstances may be. They just want the law strictly obeyed. And on the other hand, you have a society that loosely acts under the confines of the law, that acts irrationally, that has no kind of recognition towards the law of the soil whatsoever. And what we're witnessing in contemporary politics, at least and not just in my opinion, but in some of the political scientists that I'm thinking of referencing. But you have people who simply obey the rhetoric and rather mirror it of deport them all. And then you have the rhetoric that says there's no such thing as illegals on stolen land. And I think both are dangerous. I'm just going to come out and say it. I genuinely think both are dangerous for American society. I mean, if we really genuinely want to believe that no one's illegal on stolen land, then I guess that takes away from what Israel is doing in Palestine. If we want to say that there's no illegals on stolen land, then I guess we can say that no American has any right to the house that has been built on American soil within these past few centuries. Because there certainly is such thing as illegal on land, whether it be stolen or not. And that is unfortunately the history of the world. But now, yes, we have institutions in place. We have laws in place that allow people to reside legally in America. But I'm simply arguing that we can have much more efficient ways of deporting people at the behest of the American people, at the behest of safety, at the behest of productivity. And, you know, the rhetoric just doesn't match the data. Because when you call them out, when you say, hey, your rhetoric doesn't match the data, half of these people aren't even people of criminal charges, they'll say, well, them being illegal is enough of a justification. Well, sure, but that's not what the administration is claiming. And it's certainly not the most beneficial thing you can do for the American people. So, and this is the thing, I'll have many arguments with people about this, and it can just go back in circles. But if we just establish that, right? If we can just establish that the rhetoric doesn't match the numbers and the stats, then we can actually have a productive conversation as to what is the agenda of this administration and are they living up to it? And do the numbers match their intentions listed in the agenda? But speaking of the administration's agenda and whether or not they're meeting it, we have to, well, first, before we pivot into Iran, I just have to state, I know we talked about mentioning or going into policy after the philosophical argument. And let's talk about it. Let's talk about the history of immigration policy in the United States. And I'm only going to be going back a couple of decades because it is much longer than this, and there's studies that actually cover this. But essentially, the anti-terrorism and not studies, ladies and gentlemen. I just want to reference, there's policies that reflect the significant changes in American immigration policy, such as the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. And so you have AEDPA, and you have things like OIRA, ratified in the 90s. And these changed the game. They changed the game for immigration. I think according to the Mexican Immigration Committee or organization. It's a nonprofit organization that basically tracked Mexican immigration into America from the 90s to, I think it was the mid 2000s as a result, and their differences before and after these policies. And what these policies did is not only did they tighten border control, but they also did a variety of things, including restricting due process. And due process, as you and many other Americans are familiar with, is a person's right, not only within court, but in the process of whether or not they're convicted of a crime, in simple terms. And this is severely restricted. You know, and it's restricted, and long story short, immigrants have a much harder time getting themselves legalized, getting themselves into the system. And there's only really 3 channels that they can actually be sponsored, whether it be work or I think it's a spouse or a sibling. Those are really the only most likely channels that these people can be pursuing. And it just becomes a much bigger hassle. And what you see actually, because I referenced the Mexican Immigration Committee or organization, I can pull this up, but they actually do research on this, and they conclude that Mexican Americans were 50% as likely to go back into Mexico, but after these policies going into effect, they were 90 to 100% as likely to stay in America. And so this does the absolute opposite of what people think it was intended for. But that's the thing, ladies and gentlemen, because we have to understand AEDPA and ORIRA didn't pass as a result of mass immigration. And that is a big misconception that we have in amongst the American people. This actually happened because of a terrorist attack, and people think, well, maybe it was a good idea restricting due process. I certainly don't think so. I mean, a lot of cases are still backlogged, and it's a complete mess in regards to immigration cases ongoing in the United States right now. But more importantly, this happened during a time when American national security was in jeopardy. You had Clinton and his administration sitting around a table thinking to themselves, what do we do? I mean, a big bomb just went off, and Oklahoma City is under a lot of fire. It is dangerous. This resembles a new mark in American history where we actually have to start fearing domestic terrorism now than ever. So the Oklahoma City bombing happens, and they're sitting around the table. And eventually, these policies come into effect. And it wasn't because of mass immigration. It wasn't because they immediately thought that there has to be something in effect that restricts due process because too many Mexicans are jumping the border. That certainly wasn't the case, unlike the rhetoric they may hear on the very far right. But that was the reason these policies were passed. And it's a shame to have this kind of, I guess, feigning ignorance towards the actual backstory of these policies, because that is the reality. That is why they actually came into effect. But speaking of policies, past policies, Iran, as many of you may be aware, there have been updates. China's actually coming into this, right? And I'm not speaking on the behalf of China and Chinese politics, but their foreign minister came out and said that China is willing to actually play a part in this deal making to ensure that there is regional peace and there's actual productive deal making in the process between Iran and the U.S. Because right now it is not looking too good. It's not looking too good. I mean, ever since J.D. Vance pulled, big F on the packet that read, "Get Iran to concede. Get 20 years of no uranium enrichment." It was miserable, and right now there's a lot of posturing. There's a lot of posturing, and there's a lot of going back and switching up plans. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean, simply put, ladies and gentlemen, the JCPOA, because that's what the Trump administration is actually trying to go back to, something that resembles the JCPOA at least. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, something like, I think that's what it is. And it was essentially Iran getting into a deal, because first we have to establish what the JCPOA is. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was Iran getting into a deal with the 5 permanent members of the UN. I think it's the US, Russia, China, France, and Germany, right? So you have these 5 countries getting into a deal with Iran and basically saying, hey, look, if you lower your uranium enrichment, then we are willing to relieve you of sanctions. And by we, I primarily mean the U.S. We're going to give you economic relief and relieve you of your sanctions and lift them. And Iran was like, okay. And the IAEA comes into play. IAEA is conducting regular checks, ensuring that Iran meets their quota, that Iran is complying with the deals and the terms set under the JCPOA, and making sure that they are acting just as the U.S. expects them to. And now what you have with this administration, they're realizing that dropping bombs on our Iranians' heads is just not going to stop them from their uranium enrichment. Not Iranian enrichment, uranium enrichment. And It's interesting to see this administration go back because they're realizing, and I think the American people can see this very clearly, we're realizing that this administration is getting pounded by the IRGC. This administration doesn't stand a chance against a long, well-prepared IRGC who has been using asymmetric warfare for as long as we can remember. Yeah. Oh, no, you're good. No, you're good. But a lot of asymmetric warfare and preparation ever since the Islamic Revolution in 79. The American people know that this administration doesn't stand a chance, and it's not going to at this rate, that we've had too many failures in the region. And you may wonder, what failures have we had? I mean, our military is still mighty, it's still strong, it's still withheld, right? It's still having a naval blockade on Iranian ports. Failures are the administration failing to meet its goal, right? I think it was Rubio that came out the other day and said that our goal with this is to essentially stop all Iranian enrichment and nuclear development, because the end goal of this is to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon, right? And the administration has been all over the place with their agenda, but regardless of what their goals were, they didn't meet a single one. I mean, Trump cannot come out to you and definitively say that we won this war, as much as he may try and convince the American people. He can't come out and say that we've won this war, that we have stopped Iran of all of its uranium enrichment, that we've actually stalled and severely, and I mean severely, halted their economic progress in Tehran. None of this can be said with certainty given the amount of failures that we've had in this region, whether it be the economic downpour of oil, whether it be the absolute failure of our military going in and not only have F-35 fighter jets just fucking eat shit. I mean, you've seen the pictures of them devastated and even a pilot going missing. You've seen what it's like to have a military that is off the shore. And one, I think it was Gerald Ford, the USS Ford, that actually caught on fire and had to go back to a port, which some people speculate was self-afflicted and an excuse to actually get them away from the sea and the strait. And oh, you're good. Appreciate it. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen. You know, people are coming in, checking on the production. Just part of the team. I'm kidding. They're not part of the team. But the U.S. is realizing it's failing, so it's trying to go back to being a dove admin rather than a war hawk. And, you know, this is a manifestation. Let's just be honest. Trump would have intended for this to happen in his first administration if it weren't for the amount of blockades preventing him from being able to initiate a war with Iran. It was just too fresh in 2018. We were getting close to the end of his term, and there just wasn't enough time, and there was no point in initiating a war with Iran then. Now there's way more incentive now that Iran has had much more enrichment, because we decided it was a good idea to leave the deal. We decided it was a good idea to leave the deal, the JCPOA, back in 2018, and people have the audacity. They have the audacity to come to me, and they have the audacity to go to other people and say that it was justified for us leaving the deal in 2018 because it was short-term. It was short-sighted. It was sea horizon or whatever term they want to use, the terminology. I can't think of the metaphor. But they essentially say that Iran was benefiting too much. They're parroting what Trump is saying. And Trump, being his classy self, is classic. Not classy, classic. Let me correct myself. He came in after Obama spent months preparing this deal, after Obama spent ages crafting the JCPOA, realizing, because here's the thing, I'm not no Obama worshiper. I have my criticisms of him and his foreign policy decisions. I do disagree with the amount of bombs he dropped on people's heads and whatnot, but at least the guy was willing to be a dove. At least he was willing to meet with enemies of the United States to try and make amends. I mean, Hillary Clinton disagreed with this. She thought Obama was being his naive self. She disagreed with him on a lot of things too. And this wasn't just foreign policy. This was with Syria and Egypt. This was with domestic issues. This was with healthcare. healthcare mandates that Obama had, Hillary disagreed with. And, him and his Secretary of State disagreed on a lot of things, but Trump disagreeing with his Secretary of State? No, that cannot happen. God forbid they have varying opinions on a pressing matter in regards to the American government and the safety of the U.S. God forbid the Secretary of State advised Trump on a certain practice, staying in the JCPOA. Because that's what Rex Tillerson did. Rex Tillerson advised that they stay in the JCPOA. Trump said no, the deal was too good, and then ultimately decided leaving it. Rex Tillerson gets kicked out. And McMaster was his national security advisor. He also said, imagine having your Secretary of State and your national security advisor both tell you, hey, maybe it's a good idea we stick to diplomatic efforts with Iran. Maybe we should stick to this deal. And then you just brush them off, and not just brush them off, right? Because it's okay to not always agree with those who are maybe well more read than you in these matters. Even if you ultimately decide not to listen to them, that's fine. Sure, whatever, right? It's another thing to go out and fire them or coerce them to leave. And then it's another thing to replace them with Pompeo and Bolton, the biggest war hawks of the 21st century, at least one of. It's just insane to me. And yeah, you can say that Bolton was fired a year later for some of his decisions, but the fact that you'd even think of someone like that, I mean, especially in the post-Iraq era, like this guy was behind a lot of that stuff and a lot of the foreign policy decisions we had in the Middle East 2 decades ago. That's the person we're seriously replacing after Tillerson or McMaster? Really? Really? And I don't champion McMaster or this other guy either whatsoever. They've had their faults, but, it just goes to show the amount of bootlicking and the amount of echo chamber effectiveness you have going on in this administration. Name me the last time Rubio or Hegseth or Noam actually stood up to Trump and opposed an idea within his agenda. I mean, these people are all on one side, and sure, you can say that maybe they're strategically on one page to the American people, but then disagreeing in private. But the promotions, like becoming the special envoy of the Shield of Americas from the head of the Department of Homeland Security, just things like that, it just doesn't show, or with Hegseth being appointed and still maintaining his role, even with the U.S. losing their war with Iran. It just, or it becoming apparent that Rubio, I mean, the amount of rhetoric that Rubio has been utilizing since the beginning of his term to now, I think it's obvious that he's going to be running for the presidential primary in this upcoming election, and I think this is all intentional. I think that there's an absence of disagreement because it's intentional and there are deeper things at stake here, but it's, hold on. Hello? Anyways, so back to where we left off. Sorry. This was a whole team trying to stop Trump from destroying the deal in his first term. And now in the second term, we're surely not going to see that. We're not going to see it from his Secretary of State. We're not going to see it from the head of the Department of War. We're just not going to see it point blank, period. And it's very unfortunate. But yeah, this is currently where the administration is sitting at right now in Pakistan. To believe that Pakistan is actually facilitating all of this is just crazy to me, ladies and gentlemen. And it's a shame. It's a shame that we have an echo chamber for an administration. And even just the U.S. soldiers, for example, that died in Kuwait, for example, because Iran is striking all over the Middle East. And, I think predictive history predicted this. I think, ladies and gentlemen, sometimes I have to admit, I'll be debating some of this with AI. And, there's geopolitical GPTs that are currently available to the public. And I was discussing with one ideas or at least predictions as to what would happen if a war were to be initiated with Iran. And it listed the idea that Iran would be targeting several facilities and military bases throughout the Middle East. And I thought to myself, well, if a basic AI model that was computed by no foreign policy expert, I mean, let's be real. You don't have people with serious jobs coding these AI models on their free time. If a basic AI model can predict that Iran's going to be attacking all these military bases in the Middle East, who is to say that the U.S. government wasn't aware of this going into this war? The U.S. would therefore predict that American soldiers would be dying. And I mean, it just becomes more obvious when you have Trump saying things like, people die, that's just the reality of war. No one wants to see American bloodshed for a war that isn't for them. This doesn't benefit us whatsoever. There was no proof that Iran was building a nuclear weapon. And if we want to get technical, the proofs that we may have had, like the JCPOA and the IAEA regularly conducting uranium checks, there still was no proof there. I mean, they passed all their clearances. The IAEA, the Atomic Energy Administration, this organization, they came out and said Iran is not violating any of the terms under this deal. So we actually had proof that diplomacy works. And people want to say that that was short term. But now we have American bloodshed as a result of not following what was short term. I mean, this administration now, because we were talking about updates on the Iran war, they're trying to do something that was similar to the JCPOA. I mean, you think if Trump wants a 10 or 20-year pause on Iranian enrichment or uranium enrichment, you don't think that reflects the JCPOA? That was basically the JCPOA. Short-term pause on uranium enrichment in Iran. That's all it was. And it's hilarious to me to see these people that are so adamant about that deal being terrible now being desperately attempted by this current administration. This administration is desperately trying to do something similar to the JCPOA. Maybe I think they're starting to take notes from the previous administration. You know, maybe all that trash talk towards Obama's admin is actually going to come back and bite him in the butt, because the truth is diplomacy does work, you know, and I think they understand that it doesn't hurt to be a dove rather than a war hawk, especially in times like these, because like we said in earlier episodes, the U.S. is realizing that there are consequences to their actions, and Iran is definitely proving so. But with that being said, thank you for tuning in. And I hope you enjoyed this episode. In the next episode, we will be discussing something pretty important. But with that being said, thank you for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one.